guys. So it'll be useful to just be able to talk through it.
And Tina, remind who to send your codes to in order to get a certificate. So look out for that. So just to introduce Chris, he is the project coordinator for the New York Deafblind Collaborative and has experience as a classroom teacher and a TVI, specializing in working with children with severe and multiple disabilities, including deaf blindness, cortical visual impairment, curriculum adaptations for children with visual impairment and additional disabilities, and instructional strategies supporting communication development for children with pre-symbolic communication. He has the Perkins-Roman CVI range endorsement and conducts training for CVI characteristics, phases, assessment and intervention across New York State, as well as nationally for professionals and families. He also serves as a co-instructor for Perkins e-learning online course, Cortical Visual Impairment, and is adjunct faculty at Hunter College, CUNY, in the graduate programs for blindness, visual impairment, and childhood special education, severe multiple disabilities. So again, we thank Chris for joining us. He will be providing 2 more webinars in this series. So we hope you all will be able to join us for those as well. And I think it's January and February. No, January and March, right? No, is it January and February? I can't remember, Chris.
It looks like January 13th and February 17th.
Thank you.
I'll put the links to register for that in the chat.
Okay, thanks, Conchita. So to just get started again, the ACV REP opening code is range, RANGE, range. And Chris, you're on.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ruth. And thank you, Conchita. And yeah, just thank you for having me again. I'm really thrilled that we could put this together as a 4-part series, especially because that allows us to really get into some detail and depth with the content and be able to focus not just on overview, but to get into more specific subtopics related to cortical visual impairment. So today we're focusing on CVI range assessment and functional vision assessment practices in general. So we'll talk about what assessment looks like, planning and conducting assessment of functional vision. And we'll also talk about some recommendations, considerations, and guidelines for actually writing up an FVA report. I'm going to share with you many resources and tools throughout this, and I will try to drop them in the chat box as files for you to download as they come up. I'm just going to share my screen.
Oh, Chris, I'm sorry, we need to do our poll real quickly, and I'm sorry about that. Sorry, folks, we're going to poll you really quickly to just get information about what your background is, just so we know how many people are from vision field or other fields. So if you can just complete that real quickly. I'm sorry, Chris, for interrupting your flow.
No, thank you. This is very helpful.
And the first question is, do you reside in Maryland? Yes or no? And the second question is, what is your role? And you can choose multiple: TVI, special educator, related service provider, general education teacher, administrator, or other. And if for some reason you can't access the poll, it's not accessible to you, you can write that in the chat. Yes, and I will put the link to register in the chat for all the other upcoming webinars.
Great.
All right, I'm going to end the poll and share the results. So we have actually quite a people that are coming from outside of Maryland, 75, 25 from in Maryland. We have mostly TVIs, which is to be expected. We also have some special educators, some related service providers. We don't have any general ed teachers, and we do have administrators and a couple others. So if you want to put what your other is in the chat, feel free to put that in too. Thank you all for joining.
And yes, this is being recorded. And also, Chris, will you share your PowerPoint again? Like
Absolutely.
Last time.
I'll share the PowerPoint, and I think I've figured out if it allows me to drag and drop files into the chat box, I can actually put the PDF of the PowerPoint in toward the end of the presentation if you just remind me.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Great, and thank you so much. It's always extremely helpful for me to know who is here in the room with us. Great to see folks from all over, as well as folks from various different roles. Of course, not totally surprised that it's majority TVIs, because of course you're the folks who are conducting functional vision assessment. But I do want to emphasize that this is going to be important information that I'm going to tailor to you regardless of what your role on the educational team is. So, oh, the other thing, just a bit of housekeeping, I'm keeping the chat box open on the side here, and I strongly encourage you to just ask me questions as they come up. I always have way too much content for the time allotted, no matter how much time is allotted. So it's a lot better if we can just make this as interactive as possible rather than trying to crunch questions in at the end. So please do feel free to ask me questions as they come up, as well as to share, feedback, examples, or points that you want clarification on as we go. Again, I'm going to share as many resources as possible with you as well. So let's just get going. The little bit of background, the approach that I am taking and that I'm talking you through today as it relates to cortical visual impairment, and in particular assessment of students with cortical visual impairment, is based specifically on the work of Dr. Christine Roman-Lancy, who has developed over the past now 15, 20 years, a comprehensive and very holistic student-centered approach towards assessment and intervention of students who have CVI, that is specifically set within educational context, and found this approach in particular to be extremely helpful and widely applicable to students of diverse backgrounds and various levels of severity of functional vision. So I think the first session that we had last month, I covered cortical visual impairment characteristics and phases. And in depth, we talked through understanding and observing the 10 major behavioral characteristics of children with CVI. We'll do a little bit of review as we go into this now. But if you want additional background information on that, I believe that you have the recording of this webinar available to you, as well as I can share some other resources with you to give you some additional background context if you like. Also, you'll see on this PowerPoint, which I will share towards the end of the presentation, you'll see my email address. I encourage people to feel free to reach out to me as you like, if questions come up, if you want clarification, or if you want more resources. And I see now that Conchita is putting the registration information for the next few sessions in here as well. So wonderful, thank you. The other bit of credit where credit is due is just to say that most of what I'm sharing with you comes from my extensive work with a variety of professionals, including folks of all different roles on the educational team, related service providers, teachers, TVIs, as well as family members and other state deafblind projects. As Ruth said in the introduction, my primary role is as project coordinator of the New York State Deafblind Collaborative, and we are the New York State version of federally funded grants that exist across the US supporting children and youth who have combined vision and hearing loss. And I got into focusing specifically on cortical visual impairment because I realized that there was a large percentage of students who have combined vision and hearing loss that have CVI, and that were going under-identified as having CVI. So I've spent a lot of my time in the last several years focusing on this content. There is a fact sheet, which I can actually share as I mentioned. I was just gonna bring things up as I introduce them. So I'm just dragging into the chat box this fact sheet, if it works. That might not actually work. Sometimes it allows me to actually add files into the chat box as they go. So in that case, any resources that I share with you, if you'd like copies of them, feel free to email me. I'll also share these with Ruth so that she can send them out if needed as well. So I shared this with you in the last session, but just to remind you, sort of to save yourself from recreating the wheel and having to put things into your own words each time you bring up CVI and explain it to a team member, I've created a 2-page fact sheet, which is also available on the Paths to Literacy website, pathstoliteracy.org. Oh, great. And I see Charlotte is here. Hi, Charlotte. And she's given you the link to access that fact sheet. So this is a fact sheet on CVI to explain definitions. What is it? How is it different from other ocular visual impairments? What's unique about CVI? How is it diagnosed? As well as a list of the characteristics, explanation of the 3 phases of CVI, and some frequently asked questions, as well as additional resources with links to those additional resources. So hopefully that'll be useful to you as an ongoing resource as you work with new team members and as you share information with other folks you're working with. Yes, the opening code is RANGE, R-A-N-G-E. All right, so I'm not going to spend much time reviewing this, but I want to mention this is what I covered in the first session extensively, the 10 unique visual characteristics or characteristic visual behaviors that are common in students with CVI. And what's important to understand is that these characteristics do look different in each individual student. And they also look differently depending on where the child is on a range of visual functioning. We'll talk about that more intensively as we go. Those are color preferences, preference for or need for movement to elicit or sustain visual attention. Remember, color preferences tend to be bright, saturated colors. Movement, visual latency or need for additional visual processing time in order to perceive that objects or visual targets are there. Unique visual field preferences, which tend to be first on the range of more severe phase 1 all the way up towards phase 3, more typical visual functioning. Tend to start with a strong peripheral field preference, either right or left. And then as the child progresses along the CVI range and improves in their visual functioning, both visual fields, right and left, and then upper, and then central, and then finally it's that lower visual field that tends to not resolve, or that children even in phase 3 still tend to have difficulty with information in their lower visual field. Visual complexity being a major characteristic of CVI that I believe is really one of the overarching issues that all of the other characteristics are impacted by. And complexity refers to complexity of objects or targets themselves. So individual objects can be more or less complex than others. The array, complexity of the array, which can be with a 3D array like you see in this basket of toys. I'm showing a picture with some objects on it right now. On the bottom middle of the screen, you see a basket full of stuffed animals, and the stuffed animals are overlapping, they're touching each other. It would be very hard for a child with CVI to be able to pick out an individual object in there because they all sort of seem to overlap. But it's much easier if you pull out that information, you pull out a toy or an object and put it against a non-complex array. On the bottom right, I'm showing just one of those stuffed animals pulled out of the busy array of the basket and put against a clean or non-complex background on a chair. And you can see that it really pops out when it's taken out of that busy array. Complexity also refers to complexity of faces. Faces themselves are very complex, and children with CVI tend to have difficulty looking first at any faces. And then as they make progress in their vision, they tend to be able to look at familiar faces better than unfamiliar or novel faces. Complexity also refers to multisensory complexity or complexity of the sensory environment. And we talked last time about internal and external input that affects sensory complexity, including positioning of the student, how they're feeling, whether they're tired, whether it's hot in the room, whether there's noise and busy environment around the child. All of those can elevate the complexity of the sensory environment and therefore reduce the child's visual processing. So 4 types of complexity. Then there is need for or attraction to light. That's what we used to call light gazing. But it's not just about light gazing or staring at bright primary sources of light, like the picture I'm showing now of those bright ceiling light panels. It also refers to the need for light to enhance visual attention, use of light boxes, light pads, or even an iPad, as we talked about a bit last time, to enhance visual attention. And even on into phase 3, we see that kids have not resolved that characteristic of light if they still benefit from or have better visual efficiency when there's backlighting or when there's a flashlight to illuminate a visual target. Okay. The next one is distance viewing, and students with CVI tend to have a difficulty looking at things from a distance, which is really the same thing as complexity. When you are looking at a very busy shelf, I'm showing in the bottom left a picture of a busy preschool classroom shelf with lots of sensory toys on it. When you're 6-7 feet away from that shelf, it looks very, very busy. But when you're only 1 foot away from the shelf, it's less busy because you're looking at less objects in your visual array. There's visual reflexes, and we talked about 2 primary blink reflexes: blink to touch on the bridge of the nose and blink to threat, which you can test sort of like with a hand coming at your face. You want to try that in different fields and different directions and at different times of day to make sure that what you're seeing is consistent. We'll talk about that when we talk about direct assessment. Visual novelty. Children with CVI tend to be able to see things that are familiar to them better than things that are unfamiliar to them. And difficulty with visually guided reach. Children with CVI tend to have difficulty connecting their visual attention, whether they're looking at or looking towards something, and their ability to reach for and tactily interact with that thing simultaneous to looking. So we tend to see a look away and reach, or we see a look, reach, and then as soon as I'm touching it, I look away because I can't deal with looking and touching at the same time. Or a feeling around until you find something tactily, and then as soon as I found it tactily, now I can look at it. And all 3 would be abnormal connection between vision and tactile sense. Okay, so that was just the little 5-minute review of characteristics of CVI. Important to do because characteristics are really what are driving our assessment of children with CVI. It's that understanding of characteristics and how they look differently depending on where a child falls on this range or phases of severity of CVI. It is a scale or a range from 0 to 10. Although there is no such thing as 0 because there's not a child with CVI who has no vision. There's always going to be at least something there in the absence of a severe ocular visual impairment. And there's also no such thing as 10 because a child with CVI never completely resolves CVI. So very infrequently, we see some children resolving individual characteristics, and we'll talk about what that means when we look at the CVI range assessment. The phases are roughly oriented, roughly connected to numbers on this range. 0 to 3 would be phase 1, the most severe. 3 to 7 would be phase 2. And 7 to 10 would be phase 3, closer to typical visual functioning. CVI phase is determined by assessment using the CVI range, but as we'll see, it is possible to estimate and pretty accurately estimate what phase a child is in by observation alone. In order to give an actual score on the CVI range and to be certain about what phase they're in, you need to do the comprehensive CVI range assessment. But in the meantime, it will be helpful for the whole team to be able to get a good sense of estimating the phase that the child is in, to be able to help guide what the next steps are. And I'll give you some examples. Intervention must be guided by phase. It is a completely different intervention approach that we're using for children in phase 1, children in phase 2, and children in phase 3. And in the next session in January 13th, we're going to talk in depth about intervention by phase. So we'll talk about intervention approaches by phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3, and how all the characteristics fit into that. Why is it so important to identify and assess? We talked about specific interventions that are focused on improving visual functioning. This is different from children with ocular visual impairments. With eye-related visual conditions, we're not expecting the child with an eye-related visual condition to improve their vision. Instead, we're focusing on teaching that child compensatory skills to get around the fact that they have a visual impairment and succeed anyway. For children with CVI, we are actually focused on making neurological progress and strengthening their vision through intervention and giving them experiences that are meaningful with using their vision. It's got to be based on assessment. And again, the reason why it has to be based on assessment is because there are different approaches depending on where the student falls on this range of visual functioning. Intervention has to be a team effort. It cannot be just the TVI. And if you think about it, it makes sense because a TVI mandate or a TVI, teacher of visually impaired session, might be 2 times 30 minutes a week, maybe at the most 5 times an hour a week. That's not going to be enough to make neurological progress. These are interventions that have to be integrated across the entire educational program and the home environment, not in an overwhelming way, not in a way that should be, unattainable to the team or unrealistic, but rather in a way that is holistic and organically built into the child's day. So that's why it's important for everyone on the team to have this information and to really get behind these types of approaches. I want to do, just because last time we talked a bit about phase and characteristics, and I wanted to just show you a handful of short YouTube videos. If you just even go on YouTube and look up cortical visual impairment, it's a little bit haphazard because what you find is some great things and also some not so great things. But I think it's useful to observe students regardless of the actual approaches or strategies that you're watching people do with these students. We get a good idea of being able to estimate what phase a child is in just by watching a child that we don't even know for a few activities. So what I want to do here is just show you 4 very short 20 to 30 second videos of a child that I found on YouTube. I don't know this student. And let's see that even in a very short little video examples, we can actually get a pretty good idea to estimate what phase the child is in. So let's see what you think and see if you can actually identify any characteristic visual behaviors from this video too. So feel free to type in the chat box any behaviors that you're observing that align with those characteristics. And most importantly, type in the chat box if you have an estimate of what the phase is that the child is in. Is this a child in phase 1, phase 2, or phase 3? Okay, let's see.
Which one has the most? Which container contains the most water? The glass or the sippy cup? Yay, the glass. Very good.
Okay. So already we have some guesses, right? We've seen a few folks are saying they think phase 2 and they've seen some latency. Let's watch this one. Same student. Any other characteristics we're seeing? Okay. Need for movement, excellent. I see also touching, looking away, right? That's visually guided reach. I'm also seeing bright colors and movements. Visually guided reach is inconsistent. This is awesome, you guys. Let's watch this one.
Good job. Can you give your shaker now? You get? You get? One. Did you get a high five?
Okay. Good. Yeah, some look away. There was a little bit of imitation. This last one here.
Look here. Look. What's that? Is that a square or a circle? Mississippi. Yeah, come on. What's this? Is that a circle? Is that a circle or a square? We'll look at the picture.
Okay, awesome. Great job. So I saw some really, really very thoughtful comments. And I think most importantly, what you're seeing here, can we switch to all panelists and attendees so that all comments can be seen by everyone? Okay. Oh, okay. So what you have to do, okay, I think that that's a setting. I can read these out as they come as well, because I think that your own setting is to only be able to send a chat to the panelists. So I'm seeing folks say that they observed color, movement, visually guided reach. Visually guided reach, looking after touching hand, complexity of the array, looking away, puzzle pieces moving into central vision from the periphery. Okay, if you go to the to button, you can change it yourself. It looks like go to all panelists and attendees. Great. Oh, hi, Jane. I see Jane is here. Okay, good. Great. So I think what's very interesting about this is that you can see already that you can observe characteristics, and you can also get a pretty decent estimate of the phase that a child is in by observing 4 30-second videos. And that's pretty impressive. There's also something else that you can get from this too, which is a question for you here. Did anybody observe eye to object contact? Does this child have eye to object contact? Remember, eye to object contact is the ability to look at something directly with sustained direct visual attention. Direct central visual fixation. What do you think about his ability to do that? Seen no. Yeah. Yep, I did not observe him doing this. And I think maybe someone says that they thought they observed him doing this. What do you think? I think what we saw was maybe some emerging brief fixation. There is some fixation, but it's very, very brief and fleeting. It is not prolonged, sustained visual fixation with central eye to object contact. Most of his looking is that classic sort of CVI look of looking sort of through or past something. The object is in front of him and you can tell that he's looking at it, but it's not a direct central visual fixation. And awesome, I see Peggy's being more specific and saying in the first video, he briefly looked at the blue cup. Absolutely agree. Certain objects that are bright, saturated colors in a non-complex array, maybe it's very familiar as well. We don't know this student, but I'm assuming that his drink cup against a non-complex background is probably easier to see, more familiar, and less complex than the puzzle pieces, for example, which he wasn't really able to look at directly. We also saw a little bit of sustained visual attention, as Elizabeth's saying here, to his mom's face on the beanbag. And what we're thinking about when we observe that video, excellent positioning, very comfortable positioning. He's not working hard to sit up. He's comfortable, he's on his back. His mom is familiar to these characteristics overlap. And that's really the approach we want to take towards the observation portion of assessment, as we're going to talk about. So if we know that this child has emerging visual fixation, but not prolonged sustained visual fixation, I'm already thinking that he's probably at least a 3 to 4 on the CVI range minimum, and that he's not a 6 to 7 on a CVI range yet, because he has a little bit of emerging visual fixation, which means he's above a 3, but he doesn't have prolonged visual attention to a wide variety of objects and things. He tends to have much more difficulty sustaining visual attention and centrally focusing or making eye to object contact when there's complexity, when there is like not as controlled an environment and when there isn't as much wait time, which means that he's probably a little lower than 6 to 7. So I can already get a pretty decent estimate of where he is on the CVI range just from these short videos. Of course, we want to be cautious and careful about not making too many assumptions or saying, oh, he's definitely this or he's definitely that, because of course, we haven't had enough time to observe him in a variety of activities and environments, and we don't know this student. But it is kind of amazing and useful to see that many of these things are very observable, even if you don't know the child well. Okay, so let's get right into it. And we can use what we've just talked about in the first 20 minutes or so as some of the foundation for talking about the CVI range assessment specifically. Okay. And again, feel free to ask questions and give feedback in the chat box as you go. The CVI range is a functional vision assessment specifically. It's an assessment of functional vision, a protocol for completing a functional vision assessment for children specifically with CVI. And it was created by Dr. Christine Roman-Lancy. The first published version is in her 2007 textbook, and it's revised in her 2018 textbook, Cortical Visual Impairment, An Approach to Assessment and Intervention. So when you're referencing it, I put the little reference on the top right that you can say Roman-Lancy 2007, semicolon, revised 2018. And we'll talk about some of the revisions as well. There are not major changes to the assessment itself, just very minor changes of wording and format, but there are major changes to the scoring considerations and guides. There are 3 parts of the CVI range: family interview, observation, and direct assessment. I would argue that those are 3 parts of any functional vision assessment for any child. We have to have family interview, we have to have thorough observation of a student, and we have to have some time for additional direct assessment, although what each of those things look like are very different for children with CVI as opposed to children with ocular forms of visual impairment. Before assessment, you must have the results of a clinical eye exam. Now, how useful those results will be may vary significantly, but you have to have the results of a clinical eye exam because we need to know, does the child have additional ocular visual impairment that may be impacting the CVI range or not? Also, does the child actually have a diagnosis of CVI, or is it just suspected CVI and aligning characteristics with medical history? So the impact of additional ocular forms of visual impairment may affect scoring the CVI characteristics, and you just want to note that. You just want to note how they're affecting it. What is the specific impact of the ocular form of visual impairment?
I'm going to interrupt you just really quick because there was a question in the chat box that was relevant to that. Somebody asked that the student had not officially been diagnosed with CVI, and so should they still conduct the CVI range on the student if it hadn't been officially diagnosed?
That's great. Thank you for that question. And I'm putting my email address in there too. I saw someone had asked me for it. That's a really great and very important question. And I think, yes, you can use the CVI range for someone who displays characteristics of CVI but does not have a formal diagnosis, but you need to be very clear in your report that the child doesn't have a CVI diagnosis. What you're going to find, and I've found this many times consistently, what you're going to find is that if it's not CVI, the CVI range doesn't work and it doesn't give you relevant information. And you will see that it doesn't give you relevant information because the numbers don't line up. There are outliers. There are things that don't seem to fit or don't seem to match. And I've seen several children with more overarching forms of cerebral visual impairment or other types of neurological visual processing disorders that the CVI range doesn't give valuable information for. It's not designed for those students. It's designed for children who specifically show CVI characteristics. And cortical visual impairment in general is a diagnosis that is made based on the presence of characteristic visual behaviors. It's not made based on an MRI or based on a, what a neurologist could tell you about the child's visual functioning. However, diagnosis does usually come from a clinical specialist, like a neurologist, a neuro-ophthalmologist, ophthalmologist, or an optometrist. So yeah, you can use it. You can use the CVI range for a student without a formal diagnosis. And the reason that I would say that you can is because I know a lot of students who can't get a formal diagnosis because they live in a place where there isn't access to anybody who can reliably diagnose a student. So you want to make it very clear that as an educational professional, you are not diagnosing a child. That's not what we do. Only a clinical specialist can diagnose a child. But you can choose what tools and resources and protocol you want to use for evaluation. And you just need to describe what those methods are and make very clear this child doesn't have a diagnosis, but displays visual behaviors characteristic of CVI, relevant to CVI, and also has the medical history that aligns with it too, such as a neurological event, a seizure disorder, anoxic brain injury, and so on. Yeah, very, very briefly, I'll explain the difference between cerebral and cortical visual impairment. This is a topic that could be, we could go off on a major tangent here. And I'll also give the little disclaimer that views about that question and how to answer it vary widely depending on who you're talking to. But my particular approach and understanding of that question is that cerebral visual impairment refers to an umbrella category that encompasses a variety of neurological visual processing disorders, which even include conditions such as dyslexia, synesthesia, prosopagnosia or face blindness, other types of neurological visual processing disorders that don't display the same characteristics as cortical visual impairment, which is a diagnosis, again, based on an alignment of characteristics. Cortical visual impairment could be considered a subcategory of cerebral visual impairment. So cerebral is up here, the umbrella category, and cortical is one of the types of cerebral visual impairment. This is confusing because if you search for this online, you're going to find these terms used interchangeably. You're going to find, sometimes it varies based on location. In the UK and in different places in Europe, you often see the term cerebral being used as the term for the condition that does have these characteristics. So, terminology is important, but what's most important is that we have practices that are relevant to the children that we're serving. So I think as long as you're addressing the characteristic visual behaviors, if they apply to that student, you're going to get good information. Okay, good questions. So I don't want to spend too much time on this because I want to get right into the real content of talking through the CVI range and interpreting the statements on it. But a couple of FAQs, a couple of frequently asked questions. These are on the fact sheet. So I'm not going to spend time on that, but it's just sort of what to do if the FVA, or functional vision assessment, doesn't address CVI, and so on. There's other questions like that. Anyone with training can administer the CVI range. It does not have to be a TVI. I know speech language pathologists, I know occupational therapists, I know classroom teachers who are skilled and reliable at administering the CVI range. However, a functional vision assessment for educational purposes can only be conducted by a vision service provider. That could be a TVI, teacher of visually impaired, an orientation mobility instructor, in some states it varies, and a CVRT, a certified vision rehabilitation therapist. A vision service provider can conduct an FVA. All of those other folks, if you're from different related service roles, you can incorporate the CVI range into your own assessments. And I've seen OTs and speech pathologists especially use the CVI range as one of the tools to better enhance their own evaluations of students. That's great. I encourage you to do that, and it's very helpful to your own goals and practices, but it's not an FVA for legal purposes and for IEP purposes if you're not a vision service provider. So just getting some clarification on that. CVI range scores are going to be used primarily to determine the level of visual functioning. Yes, I will give you the PowerPoint toward the end of this, or I'll send it to you if you want. So the reason I don't give it to you in advance is because then I find people just download it and skip the presentation. So CVI range scores will be used to primarily determine current levels of functional vision, which is a primary purpose of a functional vision assessment. It can also be used to plan intervention and teaching methods. And I want to emphasize at the proper level, not above or below the child's current visual functioning, but at their current visual functioning level. Right, to describe the student's current use of vision, how the individual sees the world. That's a little bit tricky because we can't really put ourselves in those shoes, but we can get a decent idea of what that might look like and how it affects access to information. And also to monitor progress over time. Okay, family interview has to be the first step in CVI assessment. And again, I would argue that it should be the first step in addition to review of records in any evaluation. We need to get information from the family and from anyone who works closely with the student to determine what we're going to be looking for in observation and direct assessment. You're basically pairing observation, interview, and direct assessment to give you the combined information that you need to have a reliable assessment. Also consider information from the family can be especially critical because very often for kids with CVI, their best visual functioning is at home. Why might that be? Because of the characteristic of visual novelty. Okay, kids tend to do better with their visual processing, their visual functioning, when they are in familiar environments as well as with familiar materials. So you may get responses from the family about what the child's doing that seem to be way above the visual functioning that you're observing in school or in, you know, the assessment environment. And I want to stress that it's important to believe the family when they say that something is happening at home, even if you're not seeing it. Extend, you know, your belief to consider that they might be seeing something more because of that characteristic of novelty. Now, the interview form, which I can provide you with as well, but which is published in the textbook, in Dr. Roman's textbook, it has 25 questions. The first few of them are just background information, just gathering the background information about medical history, parent-teacher concerns, etc. What does the clinical eye report say, and so forth. And then it gets into more specific. I think the next 20 questions are more open-ended questions to get information about what the child's doing visually. Yeah, of course, I can give you access to any resources if you didn't attend. I'm not sure, that's just a question somebody asked. I'm not sure about how the access to the recorded session will be. I'll defer to Ruth on that. So the rest of the interview questions are open-ended questions. If you notice the types of questions you're seeing here, questions like, what do you do with a toy to get your child interested in it? We ask questions like that because we're trying to get whatever information the parent can tell us, and we want to interpret that in the context of the CVI characteristics. Okay. How does your child position his head when you think he's looking at something? Does your child usually find objects by looking at them or by feeling at them, and so on? And it keeps going. What we're looking for is responses that give us specific information about specific CVI characteristics. So if a parent says in response to tell me what you do with a toy to get your child interested in it, I move it, I shake it back and forth, I activate it, I present it to my child's right side or left side, I move it, I try to get it to make a motion. This gives us a ton of great information about movement and visual fields. Okay. We could actually ask a follow-up question about, do you notice, does your child look at it right away, or does it take a little bit of time to look at it? Do they look at it better when they're in a certain position or seating? Do they look at it better at a certain time of day? You can ad lib here too, but it's important that you start with the interview questions here because they give you the overarching considerations of what to ask. So, you don't have to follow this as a strict protocol, but you have to make sure that you're asking, enough questions to get enough broad information. What can you do if you don't have access to the family for interview? Get the information from anyone who has pertinent background information. And, I've been thinking about this more because I've worked a lot with children in pediatric rehabilitation settings, and we don't necessarily have access to the family, but I can ask a social worker, I can ask an RN or nurse, but I need to be sure that I'm asking people who know the child across different environments and who also knows something about the background, who knows what the child likes and dislikes, especially if there are visual preferences. I would also encourage you to get additional background information from the child. This is a great form I'm showing you now. It's just a 2-pager. The first page is likes and the second page is dislikes. This is from the Washington State Deafblind Project. And I can send you this as well. It's also on their website. But I like this because it's very open-ended and it asks for likes and dislikes as they relate to all of these different inputs: foods, smells, touch, movement, vibrations, sights, sounds, and so on. And it even considers self-stimulation behaviors as possible likes, possible preferences. This is good for getting additional informal background information that can really help guide the assessment process. Likes and dislikes. And I usually pass this out to everyone on the team and just say, everyone fill it out separately, write down as much as you can think of. And then let's get together and talk about it and better understand this student and what they're into. Okay, observation is, to me, the most important part of assessment. And I think that this is true for functional vision assessment in general. Everyone has a different way of conducting functional vision assessment. My personal way and the way that I teach the TVIs in the program that I serve as an adjunct at Hunter College, I teach spend most of your time doing observation. If I had to guess the percentage of time in the FVA that I spend on observation, it's probably 80%. And then only another, 15, 20% is direct assessment. I get way more out of observing a child than I do out of the fine tuning of doing direct assessment. Why is that so important? Because functional vision assessment emphasizes the word functional. Functional is not being pulled out into a separate room and looking at things in a very controlled environment. Functional is, how is the child using their vision throughout the day or not using their vision throughout the day? So I get as much as I can from observing the child at all different times of day, during quiet times, during noisy times, during near activities, distance activities, different environments, with familiar and unfamiliar objects, with cluttered and simple backgrounds, with things that move, things that don't move. Very helpful if you can videotape. Videotaping gives us way more information than we can observe in person and allows you to go back and sort of double check yourself. So if you can, do it. Okay. This is another resource that I think I might have shared with you last time when we talked about characteristics, but I created this little observation form. It's just a notes form for collecting information from observation. And it's a list of the CVI characteristics. But what I added to that, which is unique to this resource, is I added some little suggestions underneath each characteristic about what you're taking notes about. So that if you're not sure what to look for in terms of, color preference, you have some suggestions there about what you might look for each characteristic. So very straightforward, but I think that I've found that it's helpful to folks to have some little tips about, or reminders about, what I'm supposed to be looking for. Okay, so spend your time doing observation as much as possible. Direct assessment, and I'll share with you some resources and ideas about what to use for direct assessment. But first, I want to talk in depth and spend a decent amount of time right now, probably the next 20 minutes or so, really focusing on the CVI range itself. And the reason I want to do this is that this, to me, is the most confusing part to folks, especially rating 1. Okay, there are two ratings, two forms within the CVI range for direct assessment. Rating 1 looks at the characteristics across all characteristics, and rating 2 looks at each individual characteristic one at a time. We're going to look at both of them in depth. You have to complete both of them. The two of them balance each other out, and they give you a range of where the child is in their visual functioning. It's not an exact number, it's a range. You want to assess a child every few times per year to monitor progress. The general recommendation is that you should assess every 3 months or every maybe 3 to 6 months for a child up till age 5. And the reason is that up till age 5, a child's vision and development is progressing at such a rapid rate that you may see some pretty significant and much more rapid progress in their vision. So every 3 to 6 months up to age 5, and after age 5 up to any age throughout the lifespan, every 6 to 9 months or even once a year can be okay. This depends from student to student based on how much progress you're actually seeing. So if you see progress at a faster rate, you may want to assess at a faster rate. I'm seeing a question. Oh, if you weren't the last session, I can give you any resources that I'm sharing here. I'll send them all to Ruth, but I will also, I can send them to you if you email me as well. Can I informally assess every 3 months, or do I need an assessment plan? You can informally assess every 3 months if you want to, meaning just that you can, sort of informally go through the CVI range. Even if you're not required to do a formal assessment for the purpose of an educational plan. This is for tracking progress. Okay, so you might not necessarily do an entire functional vision assessment and write up a report every 3 months. That's not realistic, but you can track progress by looking back at the CVI range and going through it again. Okay, so here's what the cover page looks like. And you see, put the child's name, age, the evaluator, the date. There are sections, sort of columns on this little chart right here for evaluation 1, evaluation 2. This is just a suggestion for how you might show progress to fill out, your score for the first time you assess, and then the second time and the third time. You see a score that you're going to put in for rating 1 and a score you're going to put in for rating 2. And below there is a row that says combine both ratings to get overall CVI range. That is not included in the current version of the CVI range, okay? In the current version from the 2018 textbook, that row is taken out. And I think that row is taken out because it tended to confuse people and folks were averaging scores, which is not what we want to do. I still use that row, and I'll show you how and why. There's also a number line from 0 to 10. And what we're going to see is once you get a score, you want to plot that score on the number line. Okay, here is the consistently most confusing section of the CVI range. And this is what I want to spend some time talking through and answering your questions about. So rating 1 consists of series of sections with statements on them. The statements are statements of observable visual behaviors. The sections are split up into, you see on the top of this form, it says CVI range 1 to 2. Remember, the number line is 0 to 10. In this section, this first section, we're only looking at behaviors that apply to a child if they're in 1 to 2 on the range. As it goes on, we're going to see the next section is 3 to 4, then 5 to 6, then 7 to 8, and 9 to 10. Okay. Now, what we're looking at here is several columns, and we see it says OID, then another column says R, plus, plus, minus, minus, and then there's a column with statements in them. So let's talk about what those columns mean. OID just refers to where you got your information. O is from observation, I is from interview, and D is from direct assessment. I've seen folks choose to use these or not use them. I tend to use them personally in order to especially emphasize which information came from interview, because there may be something that I didn't see the child do, but I believe the parent when they told me, so I'm marking interview. Then there's the scoring statements, and this is what confuses folks the most. The R refers to behaviors that are resolved. The student is past the statement or no longer exhibits the characteristic at that part, at that number, those set of two numbers on the CVI range. And we'll look at some examples here. Plus means that that statement describes the student's current visual functioning, where they are right now. And when you read that statement, it's an exact or very close representation of what you're seeing that child do. Plus minus means that the child isn't quite there yet. They're still developing towards that, or inconsistently. Minus means that it doesn't apply to the student and the student doesn't yet exhibit that visual behavior. Now, why is this so confusing? Because we're looking at these statements based on where they are on the range, okay? So this first form, we're only looking at the behavior as it applies to 1 to 2 on the CVI range. So the way that I like to explain this the best is that you read the statement and you start with the plus, okay? Start here and let's decide, does this statement reflect where the child is right now? Okay. So may localize briefly, but no prolonged fixations on objects or faces. So let's think about our student that we observed in those very brief 30-second videos. Does this describe him? May localize briefly, but no prolonged fixations on objects or faces. Okay. Now, sure, he localizes briefly most of the time. He doesn't frequently have prolonged visual fixations on objects or faces, but does he ever have them? Is it a no? No, it's not. He's past that. He would be resolved there, okay? And the reason why is because we want to pay close attention to this word no. No means he's nowhere close to it, not doing it yet. Okay, so that's actually resolved for him. Consistently attentive. So what you want to be thinking about is start with the plus, and is he right there or is he past it? He has a behavior that's even better than that behavior, even stronger than that behavior. That's an R. If he doesn't even quite have that behavior yet, he's not even quite there yet, then it would be plus minus. So it would be wrong to say that plus minus means that the child does something inconsistently. That's misleading, and that's what confuses you. If you say, well, he sometimes has prolonged fixation, so I'm going to mark it a plus minus. Instead, think about it as start with the plus. Anything better than the plus is resolved. Anything less than the plus is plus minus, or if it's nowhere close, then it's minus. Okay. All right. So the second one, consistently attentive to lights or ceiling fans. Now, that would be a child who only looks at lights or ceiling fans all day, doesn't look at anything else, is constantly light gazing. Our student in the video is resolved there too, because he's not always attentive to lights or ceiling fans. Now, if he ever stares at lights or ceiling fans, that's okay. It doesn't mean he's doing it consistently. He's past that. Okay. If he doesn't even look at lights because he's only looking at like a bright reflective thing in the dark in a very quiet room, then you might mark him lower than that. Okay. So you see, it's much, much, much easier to think about these as start with the plus, and let's think about, is that exactly describing where your student is? Or is your student have a behavior in that same category that's a little stronger? Or are they even lower than that? They don't quite have that one yet, and their visual skills are a little bit lower. Okay, so let's just look at a few more of these and we can push forward. Okay. Prolonged periods of latency in all visual activities. Now, if your child ever doesn't have prolonged periods of latency, which is, very long processing delay, 5-10 seconds between when an object is shown and when they regard it or look toward it, then they're past that. So if we ever are seeing the child looking at something without extremely long delay, between when the object's shown and when they look at it, then it would be resolved. Responds only in strictly controlled environments. And remember, we're talking about visual, so responds visually only in strictly controlled environments. Well, our child in that video, he responded visually even when the environment wasn't super controlled. Sure, his skills were a little lower when the environment wasn't controlled, but he did respond. So that's resolved too. Okay. Objects viewed are generally a single color. Well, does he look at anything that's not a single color? Yes, resolved. Okay. Does he ever look at anything that doesn't have movement or reflective properties? Yes, he does, resolved. Okay. So you keep on going from there. No regard of human face. Well, somebody said in the comments earlier that they observed him briefly showing attention to his mom's face in that video. So he's past that. Okay, that's resolved. Okay. Now, importantly, what we're thinking about there is only these behaviors as they fit into 1 to 2 on the range. As we go on, we're going to see the range 3 to 4 statements. They get a little bit more complex. So now we're thinking about these statements as they apply to a child in 3 to 4 on the range. And then we're thinking about how they look at 5 to 6 on the range, 7 to 8 on the range, 9 to 10 on the range. And as we look at 9 to 10, it's way more complex. So these ones, we're going to be pretty much minus for our student, right? Selection of toys or objects not restricted. No, he needs objects that have movement, that have bright colors. He needs a controlled environment. Only the most complex environments affect visual responses. That's a minus for him too, right? He shows some latency, so that's a minus. He seems to attend to bright saturated colors better and also to patterns that are less complex. So these are all going to end up being minuses for him. Okay. Because that's how it looks at the 9 to 10 on the range. Now, how does it actually look to score this? Remember, this is the scoring section. It is the resolve plus, plus, minus, or minus. You can fill it out by hand, but I prefer now to fill it out with a digital copy, and I'll show you an example. Yeah, the charts are in the Advanced Principles book. Actually, no, they're not. They're in the they're only in the main textbook, Cortical Visual Impairment, an Approach to Assessment and Intervention. I am able to, with Dr. Roman's permission, I'm able to share a digital copy of the form with you if you've been through a training. Okay, so you can reach out to me. You can't duplicate them and disseminate them or sell them or anything, but they are, I can send you a form if you want a digital copy of it. Just let me know. Okay, so this is what we're doing. We're just checking off what is through observation, interview, direct assessment, and then we're writing down resolve, plus, plus minus, or minus. And these roughly correlate to this range, right? 1 to 2 around here. Okay. So this child was resolved all the way down there. So we know that the score is going to be resolved at least up to 2 on the range. So we're continuing with 3 to 4. Okay. Resolved or meets the, meets the competency is either R or plus. Plus or plus minus is doesn't meet the competency. So it's roughly split in half there down the range. So here we're looking at this child as we continued. We should start to see the scores falling off, going into more pluses, and then eventually going into more plus minuses as we advance on the range, depending on the child. Okay. So this child, we're going to score this child at a 3 and not a 4. And here's why. Okay. What we see here is we see a couple of resolves. We see a couple of pluses. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that are either resolved or plus. And then just about the same amount that are plus minus, right? Remember, if we're drawing a line down the middle, everything to the left of the line meets the competency. Everything to the right of the line doesn't meet the competency. It's pretty much half and half. So I'm not going to be thinking this is a strong 4. This is more of a 3. Okay. And again, remember, it's a relatively rough score. That's why it's a range and not a hard score. Okay. So that would be probably a 3. on rating 1, I'm going to continue to fill out the 5 to 6 section, but I'm expecting a major drop off, and I'm going to probably see that pretty quickly. Okay. What I would recommend, and what I'm doing now more often, is I'm filling out the digital copy and I'm just typing right into it. And the reason that I like to do this is because I like to write comments about specifically what I observed for this child underneath each of the statements. Not necessarily all of them, but where I have something special to say. So it helps me explain how I made that score, but it's also especially useful for writing your reports, writing your FVA reports, because what I do is I literally copy and paste my comments right into the FVA report so that you're already giving yourself all the information that you need about each characteristic. It really saves time, but it also helps make a stronger connection between your scoring protocol, your CVI range, and your FVA report. And I'm going to share a resource with you that will save you a ton of time and make things a lot more straightforward in a minute. So you see underneath each one of these, I'm writing a little bit of an individualized explanation of why I scored the student that specific thing and what I understand about that individual child, right? Okay, so I don't necessarily need to do that if everything is resolved. I tend to start writing those statements when I start to see some pluses. So, you know, rating 1 to 2 range, this is all resolved in this child. This is a sample child, Henry. We go into 3 to 4, it's still all resolved, but I may add a comment here or there. And then as it turns into a lot of pluses, I'm adding a lot more comments. Okay. And even as it gets into plus minuses, I'm adding more comments there too. Okay. And then as it gets to minuses, I don't need to add comments in there because he's not quite there yet. So Henry on rating 1 got a 6. Let's look at why. Okay, it was all resolved in 1 to 2, all resolved in 3 to 4, and then we got up to 5 to 6, and there were mostly pluses. There's one resolved here, mostly pluses. Occasionally, I'll write 2 scores in. I wrote for him plus and plus minus for this statement, latency present only when the student is tired, stressed, overstimulated. And I wrote in a comment, latency is always present when he's overstimulated or not feeling well, but it's sometimes also present even when he's not overstimulated. So he's kind of like in between a plus and a plus minus there. That's okay. I wanted to write in both scores there to give me that little bit of extra information about what I was observing. Okay, let's see. Hope I lost my mouse. Let me see if I can find it again. Okay, great. All right. So that would be a 6 because as we go into 7, 8, it's almost all plus minuses. So I can't really say he's got a 7. He has a few emerging skills here at 7, but none of these really are a 7. So I'm sticking with that number 6. That's the closest to where he is. So go back to the front and I write down 6 on rating 1. Okay. Remember the newer version doesn't include that row. Rating 2 is much easier. It looks like it's going to be hard. It's much, much easier. It looks like it's arbitrary, but I'll give you a good tip and some sort of go-to considerations for filling out rating 2. Rating 2 looks at each characteristic and you're scoring each characteristic on a scale of 0, 0.25, 0.5, 0.75, or 1. 0 means that it's always a factor affecting visual functioning. And 1 means that it's totally resolved and it's never a factor affecting visual functioning. So this is what it looks like. You have a list of the 10 characteristics and you have a scale 0, 0.25, 0.5, 0.75, and 1, and you're circling 1. Now this seems like it would be very arbitrary, right? It seems like it would be vague and not a very consistent way to be able to assess something. But what makes it not that way is that you have a scoring guide. And we used to use the resolution chart from the 2007 textbook, but the 2018 textbook has this fantastic scoring guide, which gives you a statement about what behaviors look like in each characteristic, if it's a 0, 0.25, 0.5, 0.75, or 1. And It's not exact. You may have a student who doesn't quite fit into each of these things, but you want to give your sort of best estimate of where they are depending on the statements that you're seeing in each section. So again, usually I'll kind of start with 0.5 and I'll read those and I'll decide, does my student have skills that are even stronger than that and I'm even better than that? And then I'm going to look into 0.75, or is my student not quite there? And then I'll take a step back and look in 0.25. So it is relatively straightforward if you're using the scoring guide. Now, what I will do is I'll just kind of circle or highlight, what place on the number line the student is for each characteristic. And again, in the comments, I will write in my observations. Here, I will actually cut and paste from the scoring guide, which is why it's useful to have a digital copy of that too. I can send you. Cut and paste from the scoring guide, and also write in your own comments too. So I've got the cut and paste things from the scoring guide, and I also have some individualized comments about my student and what I observe with her. And then you're just adding them up. So you're adding up 0.5, 0.5, 0.25, 0.75, and so on. And you get a total score at the bottom. And this student's total score is 5.5. Now, it should be relatively a column. It should be pretty much a column that you're seeing. There may be a few outliers. The column here is 0.5. So his average scores are 0.5s. We see a couple of 0.75s. We see maybe 1.25. There shouldn't be major outliers. If the scores are all over the place, you're probably doing something wrong. If you see a score that's really far outside, you might want to consider that score, but also go back and consider the other scores too. What you're doing, you want to make sure that you do not mark behaviors as resolved unless they are equivalent to the behavior of a typically developing child who doesn't have CVI at the same age. So the child who is not light gazing, if we take a step back, the child who is not light gazing, but if we look at the characteristic light here, number 6, backlighting supports visual discrimination, recognition, or identification of 2D materials, right? So this is a child who is not doing a lot of staring at lights, but he still benefits from backlighting on an iPad to be able to look at literacy materials or to watch videos. And that lighting really helps. That means that light's not resolved. It's closer to typical visual functioning, but it's not resolved. Yeah, I will be happy to provide a sample assessment to use as a reference. I'm going to show you something even better than that in a minute. Okay, so you want to put both scores on the cover sheet. We got 6 and 5.5. Remember that the new version doesn't have that row because we don't want you to average the score. We don't want you to combine the score. It's not exactly accurate. But I still like to use it because I like to show that it's a range. I like to write 5.5 dash or 2.6, and then what phase the child's in there too. Don't average them. You can show both scores, don't average them, and then note both scores on the number line, however you want to do that. Okay. Just some tips for scoring the range. I would highly recommend you to assess with a partner until you're confident with your own scoring. I didn't become comfortable with my own scoring of the CVI range until I had many opportunities to do some collaborative assessments with 1 or 2 other people and really talk through it. It's very easy to confuse yourself with the wording, especially on rating 1 and those statements. It's very easy to get wrapped up in your interpretation of those statements. So much better if you can talk it through with somebody until you feel comfortable. Try not to overthink your observations. Go with your gut. This is, hypocritical of me to say because I always overthink everything. And I'm the type of test taker who gets answers wrong because I think that there's some truth to every answer on a multiple choice test, right? So same thing with these statements on the CVI range. Oh, yes, thank you. I saw Joanna. Yes, scores in rating 1 and 2 should not be more than 1.5 points apart. So our student there had 5.5 to 6, that's fine. If it was 5.5 to 8, then there's something wrong with that. It's more than 1.5 points apart, and we need to go back and rethink our assessment. Oh yeah, there it is right there. Rating 1 and 2 should be in agreement, no greater than 1.5 points apart. Rating 1, is rating 1 usually lower? I think actually rating 2, don't quote me on this, but I think in my experience, rating 2 is usually a little bit lower than rating 1. Actually, I think I think that's it. But I always get confused about that too. I did look back at several CVI ranges, and in all of them, my rating 2 was a little lower than rating 1. Sometimes it's the same though. Sometimes you get a 6 for both, and that's okay too. Okay. So note it on the number line, and remember what phase it's in. Phase is critical. Eye to object contact does not start to appear until roughly 4 to 5 on the CVI range. So that's a great gauge for estimating where your child is. If they have no eye to object contact, they're probably lower than a 4. If they have some eye to object contact, they're probably at least a 4. If they have prolonged visual fixation in all activities and they're demonstrating visual curiosity, looking around and scanning the environment and using vision lots and lots throughout the day, they're probably at least a 6. Okay, so you can do some degree of estimating that can also help you to second guess yourself and check your scores. But in general, you really want to be filling it out consistently. I can share these with you as well. These are examples of what goes into a CVI assessment kit. I will tell you that there are no absolutely critical things that you must have. You can mix and match, you can create your own. When I started out doing lots of CVI range assessments and was learning about it still, I had this great big suitcase, wheelie suitcase full of stuff. I've now narrowed that down to a little tote bag. This is my CVI assessment kit. It's a little tote bag with a handful of things in it. And I know people who have like an entire room full of assessment materials. That's great, go for it. But I've found that I can get a reliable score without all of these materials. And a lot of them are dollar store materials as well. With the exception of like an iPad for doing more kind of higher level assessment. But here are some examples of what's in my assessment kit. I just took pictures of the objects. My friend Jonathan, who's a great TVI, he made a much more organized and more comprehensive list of what's in his assessment kit. And he actually included a photo, a description, and then a little check mark for what phase it would be appropriate to use that material for. Which I thought was cool and useful, but you see a variety of different things that he's got in his assessment kit. There's also, I talked about this last time, and Charlotte and I were talking about writing something about this up for Paths to Literacy, but my own little complexity of array for objects assessment that I developed, which I spoke to you about last time, is about showing to what extent can a child find a small, brightly colored object against a simple array, against a more complex array, against a more complex array with a patterned background. So I do find it's important to have these kind of things in your assessment kit. These are just little, little cutout squares of fabric from, throwaway stuff at the fabric store. And then as it gets in particular more complex, so that you're looking at actually like camouflaged backgrounds or materials that blend into the background, right? You need to have an array of different materials showing various levels of complexity, which is very important for your assessment. And especially for direct assessment, you're probably going to need to do some more thorough assessment of how much complexity can a child handle. There's also the complexity sequence cards, which is a good thing to have in your assessment kit for a child with for kids with CVI. These are American Printing House for the Blind materials developed by Dr. Roman to assess 2D complexity. And it's basically several sets of cards that show sequences of images as they get more complex. So in this example, you start with this bright yellow dog, right? And it's pretty big on the page. It's not very complex. And then what you see as you go through the sequence, you see first the dog gets smaller, then the dog's against a background, and then the background gets more complex, and more complex and more complex and more complex until finally it's extremely complex. And there is one with like a flower on it. There's one with a little spoon on it, one with a basketball or with a shoe. And these are good for testing 2D complexity for kids that can understand the activity and are a little higher up in the CVI range. So this is really like an extension material if you have a child that you know, is well into phase 2. Oh, fantastic question. I'm so glad you asked it, Julie. How would you assess complexity in a child with language or cognitive delays if a child can't understand the request to find the orange fish? Generally, I assume these students are lower in the range, but it's hard to be sure. And I want to emphasize, don't make the assumption that the child is lower on the range because they don't have language or because they have additional cognitive challenges. The connection between vision and cognition is a very hazy one, and it's one that you shouldn't make too many assumptions about. However, it's much harder to assess, right? So it's harder to be sure. What you have to do is take a child-centered approach. I know kids who don't care about this little plastic goldfish, but they might care about a goldfish snack. They might care about a favorite toy. Find what the child is interested in and use that as your starting point. And it's just a, you know, it's a little bit of a trickier process, but find something that they are interested in. You know, instead of the patterned fabric background, use different placemats that they have. Find something that you know that they want and that they're interested in engaging with, and increase the complexity of the background around that thing gradually. And I've seen it work in different environments too, but definitely start with the child. Seen lots of kids who have no interest in these complexity sequence cards. It just means you have to be creative and find something that they are interested in engaging with. I showed you the slide already, but just to reiterate what you're using the range scores with. Of course, I knew that we wouldn't have time to watch a 20-minute video, but I'm putting in the chat box a link to a video through the Maryland Deafblind Project, which is really, really great video for conducting observation with. So you can't do a full CVI range with this child because it doesn't contain all components of family interview and direct assessment. But it's a very solid 20-minute video that's incredible practice for your own observation skills. Found it to be very useful. And as you're watching that, I would encourage you to use that observation form and fill out as many notes as you can about what you're observing with that child. All right, this form. So that's just a little resource for you. And, you know, I would encourage you in following up with an activity like that to, you know, watch it with a colleague or a friend and talk about what characteristics you observed, what questions do you still have, how do the characteristics overlap, can you give a solid estimate of what phase she's in? And I'm sure that you can. And importantly, what else would you want to assess? When I show this to my students at Hunter College, we watch this in order to plan direct assessment. So now that we've watched 20 minutes of a student, what else do we still need to know? Do we need to do some more complexity assessment? What are we going to use? What materials might be interesting to that child? And so on. Now, I'm not going to get into this. This is like more learning media assessment considerations. This is resources for you. But just to say that this is a new resource out from Perkins School for the Blind from Dr. Roman, as well as Matt Tejan, who's a really incredible TVI in Connecticut. And they created a learning media profile or planning tool for addressing sensory channels and creating sensory balance for a child with CVI. We could talk about this more in the next session when we talk about intervention practices, just because we don't have a lot of time. So I want to get into talking about FVA reports. I got a whole ton of examples here on the slides. And these examples basically walk you through what I think I want to show you in the tool itself first. So I created this relatively recently, and I'll show you right now. This is for you. You can have it. You can do whatever you want with it. You can put your name on it. I realized that every time I wrote up a functional vision assessment for a student with CVI, I was rewriting the same thing over and over again. I was really recreating the wheel. So I made a template, a fairly extensive 8-page template for a functional vision assessment report that you can individualize for a child with CVI. So you got little, please individualize based on results of CVI range assessment. Any area that's highlighted in yellow is an area that you substitute with your own information, including your name. So just take my name out and write your own name at the top. Anytime you see something highlighted, it's where you have to individualize. And underneath each section, you have reminders and tips about what you should be including. So summary of relevant student background, summary of observation. Okay, here is what I find to be very helpful for folks are these pre-written statements. Okay, these are statements that apply to every child with CVI. Here's a definition of CVI. Feel free to use it, make it your own. A little explanation of what the phases are, emphasizing how intervention approaches need to be unique to each phase. And then the results section here, it goes through each of the characteristics and you have a statement about the characteristic. So here's a statement about color preferences and what they mean for kids with CVI. And then underneath each characteristic, you input your own information. And if you're filling out that information on the range itself, all you have to do is cut and paste. So I just go through the range and I think, oh, that's a comment that I made that relates to color preferences. So I'm cutting and pasting it into this. Oh, that's a statement that was related to movement. So I'm cutting and pasting it into here. And it goes on, it has each of the characteristics. Remember, complexity is split up into 4 types of complexity. These are up-to-date statements, including information about how we used to call this light gazing, but now we're calling it need for attraction to light. Okay, so you go through each characteristic, and then you have summary of results. You put in your student's name, what range score there is, note any improvement, and then there's a statement about each phase. So whatever phase your child is in, you just include that statement. So, and then delete the other ones. If your child's in phase 2, then you're just going to delete phase 1 and phase 3 and just go with the phase 2 statement. If the student is in between phases, you may include both. You may include phase 2 and phase 3. If the child is like, a 6 to 7.5 or something like that. Okay, then there is a recommendation section, and these are not exhaustive. See, it says a few examples provided below, not comprehensive, but these are pre-written recommendations that I've found to be useful to a variety of students. So individualize, use the ones that are relevant to your student and not to all students. But these are ways of explaining things like using saturated colors, color outlining, salient features with links to different resources. There's a statement about why it's important to use hand under hand instead of hand over hand and so on. Here's a statement about planning adaptations and activities, including an example of planning an intervention, which we'll talk about next time. Here's a statement about a CVI schedule and an example of a CVI schedule. Here's a statement about training for educational team members and why it's important. And then here are a list of possibly relevant additional resources. And then again, anything that's highlighted, just put your name in, put your own information into it. So the rest of what I have on the slides, since we're out of time, is just examples of this. Okay, so it talks you through it. And then there are examples of what types of adaptations and accommodations you might want to put in. There are examples of actual students. And then at the very end here, which I think probably fits better into our next session on intervention anyway, are actual examples of IEP goals for each phase. Sample goals for phase 1, sample goals for phase 2, sample goals for phase 3, and so on. At the end of here are some additional resources. And at exactly 4:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time anyway, just want to say thank you. Again, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm putting my email address in the chat box again. I'm happy to send you any and all of the resources I shared here. And I'll just turn it back over to Ruth.
Okay, thank you, Chris. We're going to do a quick poll,
Okay.
an exit poll for everybody to take for some feedback. So Conchita is going to.
Okay, it should be up. And the first one says, how would you rate the quality of this webinar on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being excellent, 1 being poor? And the second question says, did you learn strategies that you will use in your practice? Yes, no, and maybe. And remember, if you do want ACVRP, I always forget the initials, credit, please email Al Kaufman. His email is in the chat.
The closing code is practices, PRACTICES, practices for ACVREP credit. And while everybody's finishing up the poll, we're going to thank Chris again for an awesome presentation. Looking forward to his next one in January. Lots of great comments on the chat, Chris, you know,
Thank
from
you.
everybody about how helpful and practical your information is. So really appreciate it. Thanks again. Enjoy the holidays, everybody, and we'll see you in January.
Thank you all so much. Feel free to reach out, and thank you so much again. Thank you so much again to Ruth and to Conchita. Really appreciate it. Awesome collaboration.
All right, great. Talk to you guys later. See ya.
Talk soon. Bye.
Bye.